It is 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 3, 1863. The ground is still shaking. For nearly 2 hours, more than 150 Confederate cannons have been firing into Cemetery Ridge. It is the largest artillery bombardment the North American continent has ever heard. The noise is so enormous that people in Pittsburgh, 180 miles away, claim they can hear it. In the fields behind Cemetery Ridge, 12,500 Confederate soldiers are lying flat against the grass, waiting. Dirt and shrapnel rain down on them from the Union guns firing back. Some of the men are praying. Some are writing names on slips of paper and pinning them to their jackets, so their bodies can be identified afterward. They are labeling themselves for death. And then the guns stop. The silence is worse, because the silence means it is time. Somewhere in that line, a 46-year-old brigadier general named Lewis Armistead gets to his feet. He is gray-bearded, quiet-voiced, and has buried 2 wives. He takes his hat, a black slouch hat, and places it on the tip of his sword and raises it above his head where his men can see it. What he does not know is that the man commanding the Union troops directly in front of him, the man whose soldiers will try to kill him in the next 50 minutes, was once one of his closest friends. And the 22-year-old Union officer firing cannons at the stone wall is already dying. He has been wounded 3 times, shrapnel in the shoulder, then a wound to the groin so severe he cannot stand. He has ordered his men to prop him against a cannon barrel, and when a 3rd wound tears open his abdomen, he will hold himself together with one hand and keep loading with the other. In approximately 50 minutes, more than half of the men standing in this field will be dead, wounded, or captured. 6,500 casualties on 3/4 of a mile of Pennsylvania farmland. But here is what most people get wrong about Lewis Armistead. The famous story says he died heroically at the stone wall. That is not what happened. He lingered for 2 full days, and the words he spoke before he died are a sentence that no one has ever been able to explain. By the end, you will know what happened in those 50 minutes, what Armistead said before he died, and whether the friendship that has been called the great tragedy of the Civil War was even real. By July 1863, Robert E. Lee had taken his army north, not to defend, to invade. He had marched 75,000 Confederate soldiers into Pennsylvania, the deepest penetration into Union territory in the war. Lee believed one decisive victory on Northern soil would shatter the Union's will to fight. It was the greatest gamble of the war, and Lee gambled now because he was running out of time. The South was starving. The blockade was tightening. Every month the war continued. The North's industrial advantage grew wider. The 2 armies collided almost by accident. No one planned to fight at Gettysburg. Confederate soldiers reportedly looking for shoes ran into Union cavalry on the morning of July 1st. Within hours, both sides were feeding troops into the collision, and by nightfall, the geography had chosen the battlefield. The Union dug in along Cemetery Ridge, a long, low spine of high ground. The Confederates occupied Cemetery Ridge, a parallel line roughly 3/4 of a mile to the west. Between them lay open farmland, crops, fences, a road. A killing field, though no one called it that yet. 2 days of fighting had already produced tens of thousands of casualties, and Lee was not finished. Among the men assigned to lead the assault on the 3rd day was Brigadier General Lewis Armistead. He was 46, old for a field commander. He had spent his entire adult life in the military, not because it came easily, but because nothing else had worked. He had tried West Point, but West Point did not take. The story goes that he broke a plate over the head of a fellow cadet named Jubal Early and was expelled. He never graduated, but the Army took him anyway. He came from a family that had been fighting America's wars for generations. His father had been a general in the War of 1812. His uncle, Lieutenant Colonel George Armistead, had commanded the defense of Fort McHenry during the British bombardment of Baltimore in 1814. The enormous flag that flew over that fort, while the bombs fell, is the flag that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Louis Armistead grew up in the literal shadow of the national anthem. Stop and consider what that means. His uncle defended the flag. That flag became the symbol of the United States. And now the nephew is about to lead a charge against the United States, against the army that flag represents. That is not just irony. That is the Civil War compressed into a single family. By 1863, Armistead had buried 2 wives, Cecilia in 1850, Cornelia in 1855. His children had been sent to live with relatives. He was a man whose personal world had been emptied out piece by piece, and the war had taken what little was left, including the friendships that had sustained him on the frontier. The man commanding the Union troops directly across the field was Major General Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock was 39, physically imposing, and possessed a calm under fire that had made him famous. He was the kind of officer who rode upright on horseback while bullets snapped past him, not from recklessness, but because his men needed to see him unafraid. He had once been Louis Armistead's friend. The two had served together at frontier posts in the 1850s, Fort Tejon in California, assignments in Indian Territory. In June 1861, when the war began tearing the army apart, a group of officers gathered for a final evening in Los Angeles. Armistead was leaving for Virginia. Hancock was staying with the Union. Armistead approached Hancock's wife, Almira, and handed her a package of personal belongings. And then he said the words that have echoed for 160 years. "Mira, you will never know what this has cost me." 2 years later, he would be walking across a field in Pennsylvania, straight toward the guns of the man he had just said goodbye to. But the man who should have stopped the charge, the man Lee trusted most, begged him not to do it, and Lee did it anyway. Lee's plan for the 3rd day was as simple as it was terrifying. Mass every available cannon and hammer the Union center on Cemetery Ridge until the defenders were broken. Then send 12,500 infantry across the open ground in a single massive frontal assault. Walk toward the clump of oak trees on the ridge. Breach the wall. Split the Army of the Potomac in 2, 3/4 of a mile of open ground, uphill, into massed fire, with no cover, no surprise, and no fallback. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's senior corps commander and most trusted subordinate, had argued against the charge since the previous evening. Longstreet was a defensive tactician who believed in making the enemy attack you. He looked at the open ground, looked at the Union line, and told Lee what he saw. The words he used have become some of the most quoted in Civil War history. "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee listened. Then he pointed toward Cemetery Ridge. "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." Longstreet was right. He knew it. Lee probably knew it on some level. But Lee had built his career on audacity, on doing the impossible and having it work. Chancellorsville 2 months earlier had been exactly that kind of gamble, and it had produced his greatest victory. The problem was that Cemetery Ridge was not Chancellorsville. The Army of the Potomac in July 1863 was not the demoralized force he had beaten before. Lee was making a decision based on a pattern that had already changed. While the generals argued, the men who would do the walking waited. They lay in the grass behind Cemetery Ridge in whatever shade they could find. Many had seen the Union position from the ridgeline. They could see the stone wall. They could see the guns. Private Erasmus Williams of the 14th Virginia would later recall that the men were cheerful, but not hopeful. Some wrote letters. Some pinned their names to their coats. A few quietly handed personal items, watches, rings, photographs, to men in the units that would not be going forward. These small transactions were their own kind of farewell. At 7 minutes past 1, the Confederate guns opened fire. 150 cannons, arrayed in a line nearly 2 miles long, fired simultaneously. The sound was cataclysmic. The ground shook so violently that men lying flat were bounced off the earth. Smoke rolled across the field in a solid white blanket. For nearly 2 hours, the bombardment continued. The Union guns fired back. And then Henry Hunt, the Union chief of artillery, made a decision that would prove decisive. Hunt ordered his batteries to cease fire, not because they were out of ammunition, but because he wanted the Confederates to believe they had silenced the Union guns. He wanted them to think the bombardment had worked. It was a calculated deception, and it worked perfectly. There was another problem the Confederates did not know about. The thick smoke had caused their gunners to overshoot. Shell after shell sailed over the crest of Cemetery Ridge and exploded behind the lines, hitting supply wagons, ambulances, a field hospital. The destruction in the rear was terrible, but the frontline Union infantry crouching behind the stone wall was largely untouched. The bombardment that was supposed to shatter the Union defenses had missed them almost entirely. The entire premise of the assault had failed. The wall was intact. The defenders were waiting, and no one on the Confederate side knew. The men about to walk across that field believed they were advancing into wreckage. They were advancing into a fully operational killing machine. At approximately 2 o'clock, the Confederate guns fell silent. Pickett rode to Longstreet and asked the question directly. "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet could not bring himself to speak the command. He had begged Lee not to do this. He knew what was about to happen to those men. He could not say the word. He lowered his head and nodded. He would later write that it was the worst moment of his life. And then 12,500 men stood up from the grass, dressed their lines with parade ground precision, and began to walk. Not run, walk. In formation, shoulder to shoulder, flags flying. They could see exactly where they were going and exactly what was waiting for them. This was not a surprise attack into fog. It was a clear afternoon in July. The stone wall was visible, the guns were visible, and they walked toward it anyway. The first minutes were almost beautiful. 12,500 men moving in formation across open ground, battle flags snapping in the hot July air, lines stretching nearly a mile wide. Union soldiers behind the stone wall watched them come, and were, by multiple accounts, momentarily awed. One officer later wrote that it was the most magnificent and appalling sight he had ever seen. The silence lasted perhaps 300 yards. Then the Union guns opened fire. Not the guns on Cemetery Ridge. Not yet. The first batteries fired from the flanks, on Little Round Top to the south and Cemetery Hill to the north. They fired obliquely into the advancing columns, sending shells skipping and bouncing through packed formations. Solid shot carved lanes through the ranks. Shell bursts tore gaps 10 men wide. The men closed ranks and kept walking. When a shell took out a file of soldiers, the men on either side stepped inward to fill the gap, as if they were on a drill field. The training did not account for the fact that closing the gap meant stepping over the men who had just been standing there. Roughly halfway across, the advance struck the Emmitsburg Road. The road was lined on both sides by post and rail fences, roughly 4 feet high, built for livestock. The men had to stop, climb over, reform on the other side, and continue under direct artillery fire. The fences created bottlenecks, bunching soldiers into dense clusters at the exact moment they were most exposed. Men were struck while straddling the rails. Others tore at the fences with bare hands, ripping rails loose. A fence. That is what started to kill the charge. Not a fortification, not a river crossing. A farmer's fence built to keep cows from wandering into the road, and men died on it in clusters because they could not get over it fast enough. Think about what these men were doing. In modern terms, 3/4 of a mile is roughly 13 football fields laid end to end. They walked that distance, not ran, walked in formation, while cannon and rifle fire struck them from the front and both sides. There was no trench to shelter in, no armored vehicle, no smoke screen. Just men in rows walking forward into visible death. And they kept walking. Beyond the fences, the ground sloped gradually upward toward the stone wall. The Union infantry opened fire. At 200 yards, rifled muskets were devastating. The Maney ball, a .58 caliber lead slug, did not simply wound. It shattered bone, destroyed limbs, ended lives in a single impact. The men walking uphill into that fire had no cover. Some units began to lose cohesion. Others pressed forward, heads down, as if walking into a rainstorm. And then the Union guns on Cemetery Ridge, the guns that Hunt had ordered silent, roared back to life. They had been waiting. They had conserved ammunition for this exact moment. They switched from solid shot to canister. Tin cans packed with iron balls that turned each cannon into a giant shotgun. At close range, a single canister round could cut down an entire company front. The guns fired as fast as their crews could load. On the left of the advance, the North Carolina brigades under Pettigrew and Trimble were being torn apart by flanking fire. The 26th North Carolina, which had already suffered over 70% casualties on July 1st, walked into the fire again. They had started the battle with roughly 800 men. By the end of July 3rd, they would have fewer than 100. The advance, which had begun as a mile-wide line, was now funneling inward. Units drifted toward the clump of oak trees, converging on the angle like light through a lens. The formation designed to spread casualties was now compressing them into the exact spot where the Union fire was heaviest, and at the center of that compression, firing point blank into the advancing men, was a 22-year-old lieutenant who was already dying. Alonzo Cushing commanded Battery A, 4th United States Artillery. He was 22 years old. During the 2-hour bombardment, he had been wounded twice. Shrapnel in the shoulder, then a wound to the groin so severe he could barely stand. He ordered his men to prop him against a cannon barrel so he could keep directing fire. When a third wound tore into his abdomen, he held himself together with one hand and continued to give orders with the other. He had 2 guns left. He loaded them with triple canister and rolled them forward to the stone wall itself. He was firing point blank into the Confederate advance when a final bullet struck him and killed him instantly. He was 22 years old. He would not receive the Medal of Honor for what he did that afternoon for another 151 years. In 2014, President Obama finally awarded it to his descendants, the longest gap between action and award in Medal of Honor history. It took a century and a half for the nation to formally acknowledge what a 22-year-old did in 50 minutes on a July afternoon. Cushing held his own body together with his hands so he could keep killing the men walking toward him, and the men walking toward him kept walking. This is not courage in the abstract. This is the specific, physical, impossible thing that both sides did on that slope. And it defies every rational instinct a human being possesses. The survivors who made it past the canister, past the rifle fire, past the fences and the slope, could now see individual faces behind the stone wall. They were close enough to hear Union officers shouting commands. The clump of oaks was right there, and among the men still pushing forward, visible above the smoke and the chaos, was Lewis Armistead. He raised his hat on his sword above his head. "Follow me!" But it was also a target, and he knew it. The man too wild for West Point, the nephew of the officer whose flag inspired the anthem, the widower who had wept saying goodbye to his closest friend on a California evening 2 years before. That man was now walking into the hottest fire on the continent, holding his hat in the air. He shouted, "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel. Who will follow me?" Roughly 150 to 300 soldiers followed Armistead over the stone wall at the angle. They were inside the Union line. For a few minutes, perhaps 5, perhaps less, they fought hand to hand among the cannons. This was the deepest penetration of the charge. the moment later generations would call the high watermark of the Confederacy, the farthest north that a Confederate force ever advanced in battle. Armistead reached a Union cannon, one of Cushing's guns now silent, and placed his hand on the barrel. The hand of the nephew of the man who defended Fort McHenry, resting on a Union cannon. The hand of a man who had served in the United States Army for 20 years, who had fought for the flag his uncle saved, now touching the weapon of the army he had left behind. Every contradiction of the Civil War existed in that single gesture, and somewhere behind this section of the line, less than 100 yards away, Winfield Scott Hancock sat on his horse, directing the defense. The man Armistead had once called friend was right there. The two former messmates were closer in that moment than they had been in 2 years, and between them was nothing but gunfire and men dying on their feet. Then Hancock was hit. A bullet struck his saddle, driving a bent nail and wood fragments deep into his thigh. His aides urged him to leave the field. He refused. He would not leave until the charge was broken, both of them on the same quarter-acre of ground, one breaching the wall, one defending it, one about to fall, one refusing to leave. If you had written this scene in a novel, your editor would have told you it was too dramatic. But it happened. It actually happened. Union reserves rushed to seal the breach. The Confederates inside the wall were outnumbered and surrounded. Armistead was hit. A bullet, possibly two. He went down near the cannons, his sword and hat falling with him. The men who had followed him over the wall were shot down or captured within minutes. The breach was sealed. Pickett's charge was over. The 3/4 mile between Seminary Ridge and the stone wall was carpeted with men. Dead, dying, crawling, calling out. The wounded lay in the July heat with no shade and no water. Some would lie there for more than a day before help reached them. The survivors stumbled back across the field. There was no organized retreat, just men walking, running, limping back through the same fire that had met them on the way in. Some carried wounded comrades. Some walked alone, blank-faced, deafened. Union soldiers behind the wall, many of them, stopped firing, not out of mercy, out of shock. But Armistead did not die at the stone wall. That is the myth. The reality is quieter and worse. The field hospitals of Gettysburg were not hospitals in any recognizable sense. They were farmhouses and barns where surgeons operated on barn doors laid across sawhorses. By July 3rd, they were overwhelmed beyond comprehension. Thousands of wounded from both sides lay in rows on the ground. The primary surgical tool was the bone saw. Amputation was the standard procedure for any serious limb wound. Piles of severed limbs accumulated outside the operating areas. Chloroform was running short. Many men endured the saw fully conscious. The sounds coming from those buildings were sounds that the men who heard them carried for the rest of their lives. Armistead was taken to the George Spangler Farm, an 11th Corps field hospital behind Cemetery Ridge. He lay among hundreds of wounded, Union and Confederate side by side. His wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. He could speak. He was lucid. Union Captain Henry Bingham, a staff officer serving under Hancock, came to Armistead's side. Armistead identified himself, and then he spoke the words that would be quoted for the next century and a half. "Say to General Hancock for me that I have done him and done you all an injustice." What did he mean? Was he apologizing for the war? For fighting against his old friend? For choosing the Confederacy? For some specific personal wrong that history never recorded? No one knows. Armistead did not elaborate. The words hang in history without explanation, and every generation has filled them with its own interpretation. I have done him and done you all an injustice. That sentence could mean everything or nothing. It could be the guilt of a man who betrayed a friendship. It could be the delirium of a man bleeding out on a stranger's farm. It could be both. The Civil War is full of silences, but this one, the silence after those words, is one of the loudest. Hancock was in his own medical crisis. The wound was severe. He had lost significant blood. He survived, though it troubled him for the rest of his life. Whether Bingham's message ever reached him in those chaotic hours is not firmly established. Later accounts suggest it did, but the certainty of the popular version outpaces the evidence. Armistead lingered. July 3rd passed. July 4th, Independence Day, the date thick with irony, came and went. Rain fell on the evening of the 4th, turning the fields into mud and soaking the thousands of wounded still lying in the open. At 9 o'clock in the morning on July 5th, Louis Armistead died. He was 46 years old. A man who had lost everything before the war took the rest. He had served in the United States Army for most of his adult life, left it to fight for the Confederacy, led one of the most famous charges in American history, and died in a Union field hospital asking that a message be delivered to a man he may or may not have been able to call a friend. The war had taken the last thing he had left, and it was not his life. It was certainty. On Seminary Ridge, Lee had already begun the retreat. The Army of Northern Virginia pulled out on the night of July 4th, beginning a long, rain-soaked march back to Virginia. The wagons carrying the wounded stretched for 17 miles. The sound of the screaming from those wagons, every rut and bump sending fresh agony through men with shattered bones and open wounds, could be heard for miles across the countryside. One Confederate officer wrote that the sound of the ambulance train was worse than the sound of the battle itself. George Pickett never forgave Robert E. Lee. His bitterness became well known. When asked why the charge failed, Pickett reportedly said, "I have always thought the Yankees had something to do with it." Behind the dark humor was real fury. He had watched his division destroyed by an order he could not refuse. General Lee, "I have no division." 5 words that carried the weight of everything that had just happened. The 3 days at Gettysburg produced approximately 51,000 casualties. Union losses roughly 23,000. Confederate losses roughly 28,000. To put that in perspective, the entire American Revolution, over 8 years of fighting, produced approximately 50,000 total casualties. Gettysburg matched it in 72 hours. Read that again, the total casualties of the war that created the country equaled in 3 days on a handful of Pennsylvania farm fields. And Pickett's charge, the single event most people associate with Gettysburg, lasted less than an hour of those 3 days. The compression of suffering defies comprehension. It is not a battle, it is a mass catastrophe wearing a military uniform. Of the roughly 12,500 men who stepped off from Seminary Ridge, more than 6,500 were killed, wounded, or captured, over 50%. Some regiments suffered far worse. The 1st Virginia lost nearly 90%. Armistead's own brigade of 1,400 suffered around 950 casualties, 68%. 7 out of every 10 men, every single field officer killed or wounded. The brigade as a fighting unit ceased to exist. The Armistead-Hancock friendship became one of the defining stories of the Civil War. 2 friends torn apart, facing each other across the field, one dying with the other's name on his lips. It is a beautiful story. It may even be substantially true. But the documentary evidence is thinner than most people realize. It rests on a single letter, on Henry Heth's memoir passage written decades later, and on accounts of the Los Angeles farewell that were not recorded until years after the event. Were they best friends? Or were they close acquaintances elevated to friendship by the poetic needs of post-war memory? The honest answer is we do not know with certainty, and that uncertainty does not diminish the story. It complicates it, and complicated truths are the only truths worth having. The phrase, high water mark of the Confederacy, used to describe the spot where Armistead breached the wall, was not coined by anyone who was there. It was a later invention, part of the mythology that grew around Gettysburg in the decades after the war, much of it driven by the lost cause narrative that sought to transform Confederate defeat into something noble and romantic. The monument marking the spot, was erected in 1892, nearly 30 years after the battle. The story of the charge was shaped as much by what people wanted to remember as by what actually happened. 50 minutes. That is how long it took. A 46-year-old widower putting his hat on a sword. A 22-year-old holding himself together with his hands. A 39-year-old refusing to leave his horse while a nail worked deeper into his thigh. 12,500 men walking across a field they could see would kill them because they were told to walk and they did not know how to do anything else. The hat on the sword is still there, frozen in bronze at the battlefield monument. But the man who wore it died in a farmhouse 2 days later, asking someone to deliver a message to a friend. Whether the message arrived, whether the friendship was real, we will never know for certain. But the walk across the field was real. The 50 minutes were real. And the men who did not come back were real. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are always darker corners still to come.